Good evening. My name is Jake Holhouse, and I am here to do a flood insurance update about what is going on with the National Flood Insurance Program as it currently stands, what's going on with the new flood insurance maps that are coming to Pinellas County, and then kind of just a general update about what's going on with the future of flood insurance and where we see it headed. So to get started, like I said, my name is Jake Holhouse. What qualifies me to be here is I have a master's degree in risk management and insurance. I've also achieved this Chartered Property and Casualty Underwriter designation, commonly referred to as the CPCU, and I've been designated by the City of St. Petersburg City Council as a flood insurance policyholder advocate. So essentially my job is to help policyholders with flood insurance questions, as well as how these map updates affect their house and various questions like that. So to get started, one of the keys that we find is a lot of people don't know what a flood is. And so what I'd like to do is kind of define flooding. So flooding is defined by the National Flood Insurance Program, commonly referred to as the NFIP, as a general and temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land area or 2 or more properties in a row, at least one of which is your property. So essentially what flooding is that's naturally rising water from the street up into your house that creates damage to your home. And so when we think about examples of flood, we look at this picture here, and this shows a house that has damage in it, but it's from a broken pipe in a sink. That is not flood insurance. That's not what we're talking about today. That is really a homeowner's insurance type claim. When we think of flood, we think of as a picture like this. So this is the city of Jacksonville during Hurricane Irma. So this is an area that is not typically a waterfront property, and it turned a lot of homes into waterfront real estate. And so that is a prime example of flooding in the event that it damaged any structures in that area that would be filed as a flood insurance claim. And so in terms of discussion points tonight, we're going to talk about a couple things. The first is we're going to talk about the current state of the flood insurance marketplace. We're going to talk about the updated flood insurance maps that are coming pretty rapidly to Pinellas County. And then we're going to talk about the future of flood insurance and some things that FEMA is doing that adversely affects a lot of policyholders in Pinellas County. So to start with, one thing, flood zone versus evacuation zone. They are two different things. So evacuation zones are typically made on a county level, and they're determined by the vulnerability of damage to structures and roadways to be able to vacate an area in the event of flood insurance. So evacuation zones can be found on the Pinellas County Property Appraiser website, and you can see it noted there as evacuation zone A. This second piece is a flood zone. Flood zones are made by FEMA. So FEMA is basically the federal program that provides flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, as well as it dictates the building codes and flood zones for homes in coastal areas. So when we think about a flood zone, technically all homes are in a flood zone, but really what we focus on typically are those high-risk flood zones. So that's that flood zone A or the flood zone V. And what defines that is essentially a 1 in 100 year chance that the house could have flood damage. That doesn't mean that the property floods every 100 years, but what it means is that basically there's a 1% or more chance that the house could flood. And so why do we care so much? Why do we hear about flood insurance so much more in this area than we do in other parts of the state of Florida or other parts of the country? And really in Pinellas County, about 33% of homes are in a high-risk flood zone. So what that means is that basically when we say high risk, that means if you have a mortgage, you're required by federal statute to maintain flood insurance on your house. In the city of St. Petersburg, 51% of homes are in a high-risk flood zone. And specifically to your neighborhood, Snell, 100% of homes are in a high-risk flood zone. And so that means 100% of homes, if they have a mortgage, are required to carry flood insurance on the home. And so where's flood insurance purchased? There's really two avenues to purchase flood insurance. The first one is the National Flood Insurance Program, commonly referred to as the NFIP. About 95% of flood insurance is purchased from the NFIP. Even if you think you don't have the NFIP, a lot of people do have the National Flood Insurance Program. So carriers like Wright Flood Insurance, Allstate, Assurant, and multiple others underwrite business on behalf of the National Flood Insurance Program. So they essentially are the pen for FEMA. So although it doesn't say FEMA on your policy, you're still underwritten and backed by FEMA. And then you have the private market. And the private market has really started to explode since 2013. We say, well, what changed in 2013? If you recall, that was the Biggert Waters Act. And so Biggert Waters is where there was a lot of press in Pinellas County of flood insurance rates going from about $2,000 a year to $20,000 a year for a lot of these slab-on-grade Snell type homes. Well, since that happened, flood insurance rates have come back down, but we are seeing them gradually continue to rise. But the private market kind of started at that point, and it's really stuck in there. And so for a lot of homeowners, they qualify for better insurance rates using the private market to purchase their policy. And so who are those carriers? That's things like TipTap is a big one. Lloyd's of London is another big one. And then a lot of homeowners insurance companies are starting to offer it as an add-on to your homeowner's policy. So those are private market flood insurance programs that are separate from the National Flood Insurance Program. So in terms of the National Flood Insurance Program, really where do we stand? So NFIP renewal, believe it or not, it's been 7 years, actually over 7 years since the Biggert Waters Act was passed. And that means 6 years since it went into effect. This means the NFIP is due for a renewal. So Biggert Waters was designed to extend the flood insurance program for 5 years. Well, 7 years later, that is still the legislation that we're acting under. And so for the past about 2 years, the NFIP, or National Flood Insurance Program, has essentially been running on a month-to-month basis. So that means that basically the program gets extended for between 30 and 120 days while Congress is supposed to be working on updated legislation. Well, as of this recording, the National Flood Insurance Program is currently authorized to run until September 30th. Our expectation is that it will probably get about a 120-day extension, and then Congress will do what they do best, and they will just continue to punt and not want to deal with the program. And so, unfortunately for us, that means we still do have a lot of uncertainty as to what's going on with the National Flood Insurance Program. We then have what I would consider essential needs in terms of legislation. So I think that really from a legislation standpoint, what does the National Flood Insurance Program need from it for a good quality extension? The first one is long-term. So really 5 to 7 years of protection for policyholders. The second is grandfathering. Grandfathering is huge. What grandfathering does is that means that if your house was built to a separate building code and the flood zones change like we're seeing right now, you get to forever rate your house back to the building code that was in effect at the time of construction, as long as your house was built as a FEMA compliant home at that time. And so that's really big. So in Feather Sound, we see a lot of homes that should have flood insurance rates between $2,500 to $4,000, and they pay about $1,000 a year for their flood insurance. And the reason that happens is because of this grandfathering clause. The Senate is very much in support of the grandfathering clause. The House Financial Committee has shown a lot of pushback for the grandfathering clause. Our push from the insurance industry side and from the National Association of Realtors is to keep grandfathering in place. And I think really if legislation does not have grandfathering, it's really detrimental to policyholders because grandfathering is such a key to flood insurance rating. So one of the big questions we have is, well, what happened? Why did flood insurance start changing so much? And why do we care so much today when we really used to not really care that much about flood insurance? It used to just be a small bill that a lot of people paid. And now it's like every month we talk about flood insurance, and every renewal we see these big rate increases coming on flood insurance. So this is a premium chart of the flood insurance program from 1978 to about 2012, and what you'll see is rates just kind of gradually go up, really with inflation and with additional development in coastal areas. And then we see this claims chart, and claims got paid as they came in. It kind of buoyed each other inside and out. If it ran at a deficit one year, then there were no claims the next year, and it kind of evened itself out. And then bam. You have 2004, that was a pretty big year from a Florida standpoint. Those were mostly wind insurance claims, though, however, not flood insurance. And then you have 2005, and it's just like, wow, out there. Hurricane Katrina, about $18 billion just in flood insurance damage. All these hurricanes listed, and these are from 2005 to 2012. So you had Katrina in there, $16.2 billion, that grew to about $18 billion. Ike, September 2008, at about $2.6 billion. Irene in 2011, $1.1 billion. Superstorm Sandy, $7.1 billion, and that's grown to about $9 billion. And now you've had 4 years in a row of hurricane activity hitting the Gulf Coast that has continued to have flood insurance claims. It hasn't been just wind insurance anymore. It's been a lot of flood insurance happening. And so we've got this program in a major deficit, and that creates the need for a lot of reform. And so that's kind of why we hear about flood insurance so much more today than we used to. And so unrelated to flood insurance legislation, in the city of St. Petersburg, we have flood map legislation happening. And so what that means is that basically about every 10 to 20 years, communities update their flood maps to make sure that they still represent current risk exposures. What I'll say is just keep in mind, HH Insurance, that would be myself, and the city of St. Petersburg, we do not make the flood maps. We only deliver the most accurate information that we know at the time of delivery. So if you are adversely affected, please do not take it that it's coming from HH Insurance or from the city of St. Petersburg, but that is basically FEMA and Congress that is making adverse effects, not at a local level. At a local level, it doesn't, in all honesty, look great for Snell Isle. So that is why I want to just throw that reminder in there. That is not us making the rules. We're simply giving the information as to what they mean to you. So map updates. What I will say is they are still preliminary, so it could be that they get changed, but I would say 99.9% chance that the maps go through as what we're talking about right now. The second side of that is when do they go through? Our expectation is March of 2020 right now. And what's the general rule of thumb? Western Pinellas County, Barrier Island, St. Pete Beach, Treasure Island, Tierra Verde, those areas, huge winds. So what that means is the base flood elevation, which basically means the rating point and construction point for these homes in flood zones, is decreasing on average 1 to 4 feet, depending on the area. And a lot of areas that are currently considered what's called velocity flood zones are going into an A zone. Middle Pinellas, basically kind of think like US 19 type area and just go straight up 19. Pretty much stays the same. So at a local level of St. Petersburg, think Maximo, think Broadwater, think anything around there. Not much changing flood insurance wise. And then we have Eastern Pinellas. Think Snell Isle, think Shore Acres, think Venetian Isles, areas like that. Pretty big changes coming, and they are pretty negative towards most homeowners. And really when we think about flood insurance maps, what I would say is there's two considerations. There's flood insurance rates, and then there's building construction codes. We're going to kind of touch on both of them. We are an expert in flood insurance rate, not construction code, but we do know enough information to be pretty dangerous, so I can kind of get a little specific on there for you. So things to keep in mind. These are just kind of a couple definitions for you. A zone or V zone. That is a mandatory flood purchase if you have a mortgage. So you're going to hear the word A lot during this presentation. What that means is that it's basically a high-risk flood zone, but it's not a velocity flood zone. B, C, and X, non-mandatory. That means if you have a mortgage, you're not required to carry flood insurance, but we highly recommend it. Then we have this new word that came out this year, and what it is it's called coastal A zone. Coastal A zone is essentially, think of it as a rate like an A zone. So everything rates as if you're in an A zone. But if you're doing new construction or remodeling, you have to be in FEMA compliance, you have to build like you're in a V zone. So that's breakaway walls, that's the deep pilings, and it does have a pretty big rate factor in terms of the cost of construction. However, I see this as a huge win, because if it wasn't for the coastal A zone, basically FEMA goes to the highest hazard. And so if it wasn't for the coastal A zone, a lot of homes that are going into a coastal A zone would go into a V zone. And that would be the super expensive type of flood insurance. So really, to me, coastal A zones are huge, and I'm so glad we got those compared to more homes going V zone. So we have this VE zone. Snell Isle does not have any VE zones that are for homes, and so that's awesome. Some of the canals are zoned as a VE zone, so you will see those on the maps. However, just keep in mind that the homes themselves are not in a V zone. And so that's great news, because V zone flood starts at $5,000 and quickly escalates from there. And then you have historical rating, and that's the grandfathering clause, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But what that means is that when we start talking about these flood maps, if you're sitting here in a house that's built, let's say in 1985, you are not affected by these flood maps from a flood insurance rate standpoint. So in Pinellas County, any home that is built 1975 or newer can rate back to the original flood map in effect at the time of construction, as long as it was built into compliance and is still in FEMA compliance. That's huge. So you think about Snell Isle and how much has been redeveloped since 1975, and it's a lot. There are still a lot of slab on grade type homes. We will talk about those, but just keep in mind if you're in one of these, elevated or even slab on grade, but it's built since 1975, you do have some pretty good protection coming with these flood map changes. And then we have the word firm. What does firm mean? Firm means flood insurance rate map. So when we say pre-firm, that's a property built before the flood insurance rate maps. And when we say post-firm, that's a property built after the flood insurance rate maps. So in Pinellas County, the absolute rule of thumb is 1975 and newer is going to be post-firm. 1975 and newer is post-firm. 1975 and prior to 1975 is going to be pre-firm. So reading the maps, when we really start digging into these maps, you're going to see these white lines flowing through your screen. Those are flood zones. You're going to see a blue area. Everything blue means it's in an A zone or V zone. Guess what? Everything in Snell Isle is blue because 100% of Snell Isle is in an A zone or a V zone. And then you're going to see orange. You probably won't see that on our presentation because those are B, C, and X. And then you're going to see this black triangle with lines. Basically, you want to be, in this example, you want to be below the triangle tips. You want to be below that line. That means that you are not in a coastal A zone. If the tip of the triangle is pointing at you or running through your property, that means you are in a coastal A zone. As a reminder, that does not affect your flood insurance rate. That only affects your basically construction compliance at this point for how flood insurance is rated. That could change in the future, but for right now, coastal A zones are not a rating factor. So we talk about the word base flood elevation a lot. What is base flood elevation? Or BFE is what it's commonly called. It is essentially how high the first living floor of a property should be to be above the 1 in 100 year floodplain. And then, so that's the construction standpoint. And then from a flood insurance standpoint, base flood elevation is used to determine flood rates. And so basically that determines whether you're even to the flood map, whether you're positive, or whether you're negative to the flood map. So what does it do to flood rates? Here's 3 examples. Base flood elevation 8 feet, top and bottom floor 8 feet. Flood insurance rating is a 0 difference on a 1-story home for what we would call a full limit policy, which is $250,000 in building coverage, $100,000 in contents coverage. The total premium rate is $1,410 approximately for that home. Example 2, take that same base flood elevation, but make the house 2 feet higher. So put that house at 10 feet. That's a +2 rating difference. That takes that $1,410 down to $585. Awesome. And then let's go the other way. So let's take like a slab on grade type home that's 1 foot below base flood elevation using a FEMA rate. Now they might get a better rate in the private market, but this is purely looking at FEMA rates. So they're -1 of a difference, and that would be an approximate rate at $3,130. So you can see the difference to base flood elevation has a big difference for flood insurance rates. In terms of base flood elevation and building construction, specifically on St. Petersburg, so St. Petersburg joined FEMA as a participating community in 1971. And basically what that means is that's when the date started. But the enforcement started December 31st, 1974 by federal statute. And so ever since December 31st, 1974, every building permit in a flood zone has required that the house meets base flood elevation unless it's issued on a variance. So what that means is that in an area like Snell Isle, base flood elevation has always been 8 feet, and so every house built since 1975 has an 8-foot base flood elevation. June 30th, 2016, when the city released their new comprehensive plan, they changed this requirement. What they changed it to is that basically you now have to go 2 feet above base flood elevation. So if base flood elevation is 8 feet, you have to build your home to 10 feet. And so by doing that change, it adds CRS points, which is Community Rating System. If you look on your flood insurance declaration page, by living in the city of St. Petersburg, if you have a national flood insurance program flood policy, you have a 25% rate credit because of the actions that the city of St. Petersburg takes for you. So your rate is 25% below market. And so that's awesome news for homeowners in the city of St. Petersburg. So to talk Snell Isle, let's talk Snell Isle 1975 to today. What maps have we been under? So we've had the 1977 flood map. All else being equal, base flood elevation was 8 feet. We've had the 1983 flood map. All else being equal, base flood elevation was 8 feet. We had the 2003 flood map. All else being equal, base flood elevation was 8 feet. Now we have this, what we're assuming to be the 2020 flood map. Base flood elevation is no longer 8 feet. Base flood elevation is changing to between 9 feet and 11 feet for homeowners. This is not a good change. This means that basically you now have to start building your home significantly higher. And you could see on new construction, basically higher elevations, and on older construction, like a remodel, even if the house was built in compliance to code at the time of construction, you now have the 49% rule applying. That's not a great thing in terms of what it means to Snell Isle homeowners. From a flood mitigation standpoint, it is a good thing for St. Petersburg. So it's kind of, two different ways to look at it. So one thing to talk about as we go into this, grandfathering. This is that rule we were talking about. So what that means is any house built since 1971 that was built in compliance at the time of construction is eligible to maintain rating there. That 1971 and 1974 homes can qualify for basically that they can either be grandfathered or not grandfathered, so they're kind of unique rating situations, but it's guaranteed for all homes since 1975 unless you were built on a variance. What that means is if you're a homeowner sitting in the crowd and your house was built in 2000, and in 2000 you met that 8-foot base flood elevation, you essentially can maintain your flood rates even if these flood maps adversely affect you. That's awesome. We then have the second type of grandfathering for continuous coverage. What that means is any home that has maintained FEMA flood insurance since basically prior to the zone change gets to maintain that rating. I will say, however, though, that typically involves pre-firm homes. So that's those slab on grade built prior to 1975 homes. If you are a pre-firm home, although you're grandfathered, your rate still has to go up per FEMA legislation, 15% to 18%. So while grandfathering helps, I just want to be honest, you're still going to see rate increases coming based on these new flood maps. And so that is just something to keep in mind. So pre-firm structures. One of the big questions we get is, well, how high can my rate go? Chances are, if you're living in a pre-firm structure, there's about a 95% chance your flood insurance rate has increased significantly in the past 10 years. Based on current FEMA legislation, which again is still based on the Bigger Waters Act, your rates are going to continue to go up until they hit their elevation certificate rate. Well, how high does that mean? We don't know unless you have an elevation certificate. If you have an elevation certificate, you can ask your current insurance agent, or you could ask HH Insurance or any insurance agent to look at it and give you an elevation certificate based rate. And that basically tells you when your rate's going to stop going up. It can't hurt you. Get an elevation certificate. It can only positively affect your flood rates when you get that elevation certificate. So to jump into looking at flood maps, we're going to just kind of jump right into it and go through it with you guys. This is Snell Isle essentially in a nutshell. You see there's not many white lines that run through it because all of Snell Isle is in the same flood zone. So it's circled on there, but to zoom in a little bit, it is an 8-foot base flood elevation, zone AE. So every house in Snell Isle is in an 8-foot base flood elevation on today's flood maps. That is going to change on these new flood maps. So, and keep in mind that so it's all 8 foot, it is all zone AE, and what that means is that if a house is being built as new construction, they have to basically have their front door at 10 feet or higher because of that freeboard requirement that the city of St. Petersburg has. It to be 2 feet above base flood elevation, so that's where the 10 feet comes from. So we start looking at these new flood maps and we say, wow, these numbers are higher. So you're going to see 2 red circles on here. And I'm going to go kind of slow through this section, but I will also provide you resources to find these maps on your own so you can compare it to your exact home. So what I would suggest is If your home is like split between zones, don't try to find it on here. One, this presentation will be online, but two, we are providing the links to how you can find your exact flood zone for these changes. So what we see are two things. At the top of the screen, you see zone AE, elevation 9 feet. So that's basically, look at that. That is pretty much all homes that are not waterfront in Snell Isle that are kind of in that, western side of Snell Isle are taking a 1 foot base flood elevation increase. So they're going from 8 feet to 9 feet. You then kind of in the bottom right or middle of the screen see zone AE 10 feet. That is basically on the right side or the bottom side of that white line running. And what that means is for those homes, their base flood elevation is going from 8 feet to 10 feet. And then you see that black line running through, that's that coastal A zone. And so what that means is basically if that house is going to be rebuilt or even just pulling a remodeling permit, it has to be in compliance of V zone standards. So you say, wow, that's a big change when you think about it. So that means one, base flood elevations are going up. Two, so base flood elevation goes up. So if you've got that house that's built in 2005 and you want to go pull a big remodeling permit on it now you might have the 49% rule applying. And then you've got that coastal A zone in the event that it's a knockdown type property and somebody wants to build a new house, it's going to be significantly more expensive for them to do so. So we kind of wrap around. We're just going to kind of wrap through all of Snell Isle. You kind of see that same theme. You see that basically base flood elevation is going to 10 feet for a lot of these waterfront homes and 9 feet for the non-waterfront homes. And you see that coastal A zone kicking in there. You do see the word VE elevation 13 doesn't apply. That is basically the water. We can't build on top of water. We don't have homes over water. And so not really an issue to have that V zone sitting there. So don't really pay a lot of attention to that one, but more look at these A zones and the changes happening on these A zones. As we continue to wrap around, kind of the same thing, but you even see an 11-foot base flood elevation starting kind of at that tip of Brightwaters Boulevard there. Well, that's pretty bad because that's going from 8 feet to 11 feet. And so that means that if that house gets rebuilt, so a knockdown and a rebuild, and a house currently sits, very artistically designed, sitting at around 8 feet, now they've got to build that front door to 13 feet. So, I'm not an architect. I don't get into the architecture side of things, but I will say you will probably see a different type of style of home in Snell Isle in the future based on these flood maps, because now it starts to make sense to do the garage below the house and the house above the garage, because you've got to be building up, in this case, to 13 feet. Well, that's about 8 feet above ground level, and so you might see a little bit of change coming for that. The other thing is you have the coastal A zone. So now these homes that previously did not have that deep piling breakaway wall type requirement now have a different type of construction code requirement. So we'll keep going around Bel Air Drive Northeast on the bottom side there. Just keep in mind that that is a zone AE10. So those are non-waterfront technically. They're on that lake there. Those are taking a pretty big hit. And then, basically inland homes are taking a hit up a foot. And then now on Bayview Drive Northeast, there are some waterfront homes in there that are staying at a 9-foot base flood elevation. So from a waterfront standpoint, those homes are the least affected, and they are also not in a coastal A zone. We jump around to Eden Isle, really the same story. We do have a little bit of a 10-foot base flood elevation for some of the condos in there. But for the most part, we're seeing 9 and 10-foot base flood elevations kind of across the board. So really the long and short of it is base flood is going up for most homes that are off the water, 1 foot. Base flood is going up for most waterfront homes by 2 feet. And for a select group, it's going up by 3 feet. So when we think about that, we say, man, that's really going up. But then we have this difference in terms of construction code. And so for that guy in that 11-foot base flood, if he goes to rebuild or it's a knockdown home or something like that, now they have to rebuild to 13 feet. That's a big difference. Second part of that, coastal A zones. On a coastal A zone, it has to be built to a V zone standard. V zones, on an A zone, you measure the construction elevation as the top of the bottom floor. On a V zone, you measure it to the bottom of the bottom floor. And so what that means is you have to add 1 foot onto that. So for that 11-foot base flood elevation, now it actually has to go to about 14 feet. That's a major change from what happened. If somebody pulled a building permit in 2015, they could build at 8 feet. Now in 2020, essentially, they have to build at 14 feet. And as of today, they'd have to build at 10 feet. So 8 feet without freeboard, 10 feet with freeboard, and now on these new codes, potentially 14 feet for those homes that are in that 11-foot base flood elevation. Major, major change to Snell Isle flood insurance. And so that is a pretty big, like I said, that's a big change for new construction, is that code change could be 6 feet higher than what it was for a house built in the first part of 2016. The other side of that is remodeling. If you want to go remodel a home that currently is FEMA compliant, now you're out of FEMA compliance. So now you have the 49% rule kicking in. It used to be called the 50% rule. St. Petersburg, as well as most municipalities, changed that to the 49% rule about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. And so that's a big consideration in there as these flood zones change, is that it does affect what you can do from a renovation standpoint on a lot of these homes. So can I see the maps online? Absolutely. I'm going to go slow through this slide so people can write it down. But if you want to look at all of the maps, go to the website, msc.fema.gov. You'll click, you'll click through it and you'll select state as Florida, county as Pinellas, city as St. Petersburg, and then go to preliminary products. That pulls up all of the new flood maps for you to see. Second way, if you're worried about your specific house or something like that, Pinellas County Property Appraiser has done an incredible job to help people get information. If you go to pcpao.org, again, that's pcpao.org, go to your house, and on there you'll see something that says flood zone. If you click compare preliminary to current FEMA maps, it will pull up the new maps on an overlay basis. It looks like this. You can then click inside a flood zone, and on that box, it's going to pull up and say basically what the current base flood elevation is and what the new base flood elevation is, and what the current flood zone is and what the new flood zone is. It does not tell you basically the coastal A zone or not, but that's that black line running through there, so you can basically be able to see that as well, to be able to see if you're in the coastal A zone or not. Future of flood insurance. This is a tricky one. This is purely my opinion. This is not based on anything that we have from FEMA, but what I'll say is pre-firm properties. That's the slab on grade type homes, basically, again, pre-firm, built prior to 1975. About 60% of the market can find a better rate going to the private market compared to FEMA. So unless it's a very, very high risk pre-firm in Snell Isle, you can find better rates. Post-firm. Keep in mind, if you're post-firm and you're Snell Isle and you're like, oh my gosh, this is big, I don't know what's going to happen to my flood rate, you have grandfathering. So 99% of you will qualify for grandfathering, if not 100% of the post-firm properties. So you don't have to hit the panic button. However, there is this new legislation FEMA has been working on, and what it's called is Flood Rating 2.0. We don't have enough information to understand what it means to your post-firm property right now, but it could have a factor. FEMA has not talked about grandfathering or anything like that, so don't hit the panic button yet. And as more information comes out, we will definitely be giving it to you. So, Flood Risk 2.0, what is it? What it does is it basically changes FEMA's rating algorithm. So FEMA has used the same algorithm since the 1970s to determine flood rates. So what that means is that coastal homes, be prepared to pay more for flood insurance. Non-coastal homes are going to pay less for flood insurance. What defines coastal? We don't know. What defines non-coastal? We don't know. What defines how they're going to rate anything? Again, we don't know. We just have the excerpt from FEMA's website. So they're basically going to start putting technology mapping in to have an individual risk rate. Well, what that means is that basically it's going to charge for different types of flood. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's a great thing because right now, like river flooding is not charged for like coastal flooding. And you look at the devastation that happens in areas like Missouri when the rivers flood, and you say, well, man, Florida's a donor state. Well, now they're going to start getting charged for that type of flood. Distance to coast is going to be a big one, but we don't know that definition yet. And then alternative sources of flooding is going to happen. The other is cost to rebuild a home. What that means is that higher value coastal homes are going to get nailed twice on Flood Risk 2.0. So although FEMA only provides $250,000 of coverage, they find that homes that are higher value have higher losses. And so they're going to start charging based on the total insured value. And so that could be pretty bad for a lot of homeowners. But again, we don't know enough because you've got that grandfathering for built-in compliance. You've got grandfathering for continuous coverage. You've got a lot of factors going in there that are a lot of unknowns. So I would say just do not hit the panic button at this point because we don't know what it means. Because even FEMA's website tells you that there are caps on premium increases. There are things like grandfathering in there. So I don't want to sound off the alarms yet, but I do just want to bring in awareness that that is coming probably late 2020, early 2021. We're not sure of the exact date at this point. So again, nobody knows. We're looking at probably 2021, and at this point, it's all speculation. It could be a $100 increase, it could be a $1,000 increase, and once we have these new rates, we'll be able to have better definitions for you. Conclusion. Unfortunately, this is probably the toughest meeting that we have to deliver because Snell Isle is, and city limits of St. Petersburg, probably the most or second most adversely affected area based on these new flood maps. The only one that's worse is like the Bahama Shores area. Outside of that, Snell Isle is really the most affected. So as an overall size of neighborhood, Snell Isle definitely has the most homes that I have seen that are going to be affected by this. The current flood market, like we said, it's still in a state of flux. We don't have all the legislation approved yet or anything like that, but we do have a thriving private market that is continuing to write more business. Flood maps, review it on an individual level. It's really hard to look at it and tell you what it means unless you look at it individually and with an elevation certificate. If you don't have an elevation certificate, I did forget to mention this earlier, they're really easy to get. They can come from a licensed land surveyor. Any licensed land surveyor can do them, and the going rate is about $150 to get one completed. If you hear a rate that's more than that, that rate is too high. But there are rates for about $150, and you can get one. And again, it cannot hurt your rate. It only helps you have more information and only helps you actually slow down your rate increases. And then that flood rating 2.0, again, we don't have enough information, purely assumption based at this point, but I think that, something's going to change. We don't know what, but I would not be super worried about that rating right now. And so with that, that is really our presentation. If you have any additional questions, again, my name is Jake Holhouse. I'm with HH Insurance, and I'm also the City of St. Petersburg policyholder flood insurance advocate. Our office phone number is 727-498-5551. Email address is sales, S-A-L-E-S, at hinsgroup.com. If you want to send us an email, if you're curious what this means to your flood insurance, two things you're going to need. Declaration page of your current policies so we know what's going on with it, elevation certificate. If you don't have those, still reach out and we can help you try to track them down so that we can look at it with you. And then our website is www.hinsgroup.com. Look forward to speaking with you. And if anything comes up, just give us a shout. Thanks so much and hope you have a great evening.